Good morning, you all. Welcome. Thank you for getting up early. Thank you for adjusting your schedules so that those who need to go to the last rites of Miss Helen Clayburgh Groves could be there. So we really appreciate you adjusting your schedules to hear the renowned Dr. David Schmidly, who followed in the footsteps of Vernon Bailey, one of the first naturalists of Texas. And so he's here to give us a presentation about his work, which continues, and I'll read a bit of his biography to you. David Schmidly was from a native of Levelland, Texas. He spent his entire career in higher education. He served as president of his alma mater, Texas Tech University, Oklahoma State University, and the University of New Mexico. He's an internationally respected researcher and scientific author, having published 13 natural history and conservation books and more than 150 scientific articles about mammals in Texas and Mexico. His most recent book, Texas Natural History in the 21st Century, will appear later this month. And there's postcards on your tables with information about how to order this book upon its publication. So please join me in welcoming Dr. David Schmidly.
Thank you, Mary Margaret. Appreciate it. Thank you. It's very good to be with you, to be back in the state of Texas and back in San Antonio. You may be wondering about why somebody that lives in New Mexico is in Texas trying to tell people about Texas conservation. But Janet and I, my wife's here, Janet, we spent almost all of our lives in Texas. We moved to New Mexico and retired there after I worked at the university. But our friends, when they introduce us, they say, "This is Dave and Janet Schmidly. They live out here, but they're really Texans." And that's a statement we're very proud of. I have spent almost all of my entire adult life studying Texas mammals. I started when I was an undergraduate student at Texas Tech in the early 1960s, and I continued my work on Texas mammals. I worked for the Aggies for 25 years, and then I was privileged to go back to Texas Tech and have continued my work in mammals since then. I published my first paper on Texas mammals in 1966, and I've continued to publish on Texas mammals ever since then. I think I may be one of the few people that have been in all 254 Texas counties doing either some kind of biological work or some kind of observation regarding the ecology of the state. So it's a place I love dearly and a place that I've spent a lot of my life trying to understand. And what I want to talk to you about today is where we sit in terms of Texas natural history today, a little bit about the history of how things have changed in the state, and some of the ideas that we might want to explore in terms of the rest of this century to ensure that we maintain this incredible fauna that the state is known for. And we all, I think, if you call yourself a Texan, you're very proud of the place. I know I am. And people's pride and understanding of the state goes back a long way. You look at the great playwright Oscar Wilde, what he wrote in 1882, and you'll get a perspective about what people saw then as the potential of this state. And so I think it's an interesting question to ponder as we look through the remainder of this century. What about that statement? Will we be saying the same thing about Texas in 2100 as Oscar Wilde did in describing its natural history in 1882? And that's a big part of the reason why I wrote this book, Texas Natural History in the 21st Century. And I was joined in that effort by two of my colleagues at Texas Tech, Robert and Lisa Bradley. And collectively, we've spent over 100 years studying Texas mammals. And I will tell you that the patterns we see in mammals are the same patterns you will see in reptiles and amphibians and in birds. The picture of terrestrial vertebrates in this state is pretty much mirrored by what you find with the mammal fauna. And of course, we're entering a period of global concern about conservation. Climate change, habitat loss pushed a lot of species to the brink. Some conservationists are estimating there could be more than 1 million species of wildlife on the globe become extinct by the middle of this century, unless things change, unless we begin to do some things differently. And Texas, I can promise you, will not be immune from that situation. So our book takes a look at what happened in the 20th and early part of the 21st century with the Texas mammal fauna, a little bit about reptiles, and then we talk about some strategies that can be pursued through the remainder of this century that might mitigate and help with some of these challenges. Now, Texas has been a unique place. It's always been known for its uniqueness. And here are just some of the things that you need to keep in mind in terms of how its unique aspects relate to conservation. First of all, it was relatively late to the human settlement game. Statehood, 1845. By 1850, there were only 200,000 people living in this state. That's less than 1% of the U.S. population then. By 1900, the time my grandparents immigrated to the state, there were 3 million people, less than 4% of the population of the country. And today, there are 29 million Texans. And you've seen a tremendous increase and spread of people all over the landscape in this state. And there's been a radical demographic shift that's very important in terms of conservation issues. You go back to 1900, most of the state was rural. The largest city in Texas in 1900, we're in it right now, San Antonio, had 60,000 people. And now it's just the reverse. Only 14% of Texans, more or less, live in the country. The majority of them are in urban areas. There's very little public land in Texas, and that makes Texas unique from most other states. 95% of this state is in private land ownership. And any successful conservation effort will require the participation of private landowners and the cooperation. And only a very small percentage of Texans actually own huge blocks of land. And one of the best things that's happened in conservation has been the development of the last half of the 20th century when game ranching of wildlife became big business. And it became possible to make a profit as a result of managing your habitat carefully for wildlife species. And now we're entering an era where some people would like to see more of this wildlife privatized. And I will tell you from my perspective, I don't think that's a very healthy move or motivation. We need to make sure, for the benefit of Texans, that wildlife remains a public resource. And then Texas shares 1,250 miles of a border with Mexico. Mexico is one of the richest biological diversity countries in the world. I can tell you the wildlife doesn't care about the difference between the two. They're moving back and forth across that border all the time, and any physical barrier that is put in place along that border will create challenges for many wildlife species. And then finally, you have to understand the richness of the Texas fauna. Almost half of the species, right at half of the species in the entire country live here in Texas. And as I say, so goes conservation in Texas, so goes conservation across much of the country. There are over 200 species of mammals that live in our terrestrial habitats or along the Texas coast. And so the book, the new book, is really a sequel to this book that I wrote when I was president of Texas Tech in 2002, Texas Natural History: A Century of Change. So what we've done is updated this book looking at the first part of the 21st century and our predictions through the end of the century. And the book includes a reprinting of this famous book that was first produced in 1905. It's kind of hard to find now. It's no longer in print, obviously, called The Biological Survey of Texas. And that was the first serious scientific effort to understand the fauna of Texas, was this publication right here. And the new book includes a complete reprinting of that book, that old book, with annotations to update and modernize it. And so the book is arranged into 8 chapters in 4 sections. The first section is a background of the Biological Survey and the history of it and a discussion of the main leaders of it. The second section is a historical look at landscapes, land uses, and how they changed in the 20th and 21st century. The third section goes into great detail about the Texas mammal fauna, what the current status is, what the conservation problems are. We go almost to every species of Texas mammal and discuss extensively what its conservation status is. And the fourth section is a new section I prepared on conservation issues, challenges, and strategies. The book includes a foreword by Fred Bryant. Many of you know Fred. He, for a long time, was the director of the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Institute, a leading player in Texas conservation. And it includes an afterword by Robert Dowler, who's professor and a distinguished mammalogist at Angelo State University. The book is very encompassing. It's over 700 pages, has over 800 references cited, and about more than 100 illustrations of what Texas was like a century or more ago. Here are the 2 protagonists that led the Biological Survey, very famous people. The one on the left is Seahart Merriam. He was the organizer of the Bureau of Biological Survey, which was the forerunner of the Fish and Wildlife Service. The man on the right is Vernon Bailey, and he did the Texas survey. He was in charge of the Texas survey, which took place from 1885 to 1905. If you're interested or think you might be in Bailey, I wrote a biography of Bailey, which was published by the A&M Press in 2018. He was a most interesting man. He grew up on the prairie with no formal education, taught himself how to collect mammals, how to prepare mammal specimens, how to document them, and serendipitously met Dr. Merriam, who took him under his wing and hired him as the first chief field naturalist and the only person to ever hold that title in the U.S. government. He was a legendary figure. He ended up marrying Merriam's sister, Florence Merriam Bailey, who was the leading female ornithologist of her era. And there's a beautiful biography of Mrs. Bailey out, published by the A&M Press too. A very notable scientific couple, one of the leading scientific naturalist couples in the United States in the first half of the 20th century. Well, this biological survey was no little just whirlwind tour of Texas. These people visited over 200 sites in the state. You can see the locations in every ecological region of the state. They spent 20 years traversing the state. not in four-wheel drive Ford 250s, air-conditioned. They traveled from place to place with railroad vouchers. They got off and they hired campmen. They rented horses and mules. And there they are, the upper picture, that's in the Pecos country, Pecos River country. And down below there in the Big Bend country, you can see them preparing specimens and preparing their biological reports. What I did was to locate the archives of all of this material in Washington, D.C. You can see field notes, photographs, descriptions of all of these places, probably close to 20,000 pages of material, 1,000 or so black and white photographs. And thanks to a grant from the Robert and Helen Clayburgh Foundation, and with some assistance from the Texas Nature Conservancy, we assembled all of this material, we copied it all, and it has been placed at the Southwest Archives collection at Texas Tech University. So it is available for people to go there and access and look at this material directly if you're interested in it. So where was Texas at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century? Well, we still had abundant wildlife habitat. The native fauna was intact. There was not much habitat conversion, not much land fragmentation at that time. Remember, there were only about 3 million people living in Texas at the beginning of the 20th century. We were beginning to see some evidence of overgrazing and land abuse, brush encroachment, but we still had abundant grassland habitat all over the state. And as you'll see from these old photographs, abundant natural surface water, springs, creeks, and rivers. So let me just show you a few landscape shots of places you might find familiar. And this ties in very nicely with Mary Margaret's new book, in which they highlight some of the landscape landscape paintings done by James McCann. Here we see salt marsh habitat in the upper photograph around Alvin, Texas. Below that is near Port O'Connor, good coastal prairie habitat still in place with chaparral. Most of that area now is very heavily fragmented. Bailey and the biologists found extensive populations of Atwater's prairie chicken. Moving out into the hill country, shots like this from Kerrville. This is from Howard Lacey's ranch. Howard Lacey was an Englishman who was a goat rancher. He didn't care much for goats. He preferred butterflies and mammals. And so he hosted Vernon Bailey on several trips into the hill country and accompanied Bailey while they were studying wildlife out there. But you can see the signs of overgrazing from sheep, and we're beginning to see the spread of juniper, things like that. Down in South Texas, around San Diego, you see the chaparral country, cactus, mesquite, very abundant. The coneflowers in the upper right, and then notice San Diego Creek there and the abundant amount of water in that particular watershed. Down in Brownsville, the extensive groves of palms. The fauna from Brownsville was very much related to that of Mexico to the south, subtropical fauna. And the natural palm groves like that were found only in that part of the state. And of course today, except for 1 or 2 protected sites, most of that habitat has disappeared. Moving up the river toward Laredo, you can see the extent of the Rio Grande, but you notice that the South Texas brush country and that habitat is still intact at that time. And then over to the Pecos River, free-flowing, no dams. And interestingly, I will tell you, from a mammalogy perspective, the Pecos River is more of a barrier than the Rio Grande. It has been to the movement of mammals, which is an interesting thing I've just written about. Fort Stockton. This has been called the greatest example of man's abuse of nature in the entire history of Texas. This is Comanche Springs at Fort Stockton. It ran for 30 miles. It was one of the longest springs in the United States. Very abundant. It was so extensive, it had muskrat populations. It was completely pumped dry to irrigate pecan orchards in the first half of the 20th century. In effect, it was dry by the early 1960s, and of course the muskrats disappeared. Bailey visited Big Bend National Park in 1890. He took these photographs. Of course, it was not a national park then. They were farming watermelons down along the river, as you can see in that lower photograph. Notice how open the habitat is along the river. I took these pictures in 1977. I did an extensive survey of the riparian areas along the river for the National Park Service. And you'll notice by this time, salt cedar, other invasive plants had pretty much taken over the river, and the ecology had changed a lot by the time this area became a national park. There it is in 2000, almost dry. And this is going to be one of the major challenges in the state of Texas, is going to be the situation with water. And I'll tell you that water is not only necessary for humans, it's also necessary for wildlife. It's going to be one of the biggest challenges we face. Moving up to the high plains, that top shot up there is from Dimmitt, Texas, which is today all cotton farms. It was a short grass prairie in 1900. And the lower picture is Tierra Blanca Creek. That creek started in eastern New Mexico. It flowed all the way across the northern panhandle. That lower picture is from Hereford, Texas. And it flowed into the saltwater fork of the Brazos River. That's the kind of water resources that were present at the time of the biological survey. This is First Creek up in the Texas Panhandle in Lipscomb County. And you can see the abundance of water in that creek. And that was the home of muskrats, okay? And we thought muskrats had disappeared. And when I was president of Oklahoma State University, I became very acquainted with T. Boone Pickens. Many of you probably know Boone, or at least know of him. And Boone had a ranch not too far from where this creek was. And he was dredging the creek bed in that ranch to restore surface water. He called me one day and he said, "Dave, I think there's muskrats out here." And I said, "No, Boone, there's no muskrats left." I said, "Those have to be nutria, introduced nutria." He said, "Okay." Well, about 3 days later, he landed his plane in Stillwater. He came over to my office, dumped a muskrat on my desk, and said, "Dave, I thought you told me you were a mammalogist." Well, it was a muskrat, and Boone had restored enough of that habitat to bring muskrats back, okay? And that goes to show you, with good land management and good water management, what is entirely possible in terms of Texas conservation. Whoops. Well, we'll just go on to this. There we go. You see these prairie potholes up in the panhandle? Abundant habitat for wildlife, particularly game birds. And there in the lower one is the big thicket. That photograph was taken in 1904 in Liberty County. And in 1904, Bailey observed ivory-billed woodpeckers in that particular place. And of course, they're now extinct in the state. What's caused all of this change? Land conversion and development. We've seen a major decline in rivers, springs, and water resources. We see changes in the rangelands, brush encroachment, overgrazing, and fire suppression have caused rangeland changes. Habitat degradation caused by land fragmentation. You're seeing that abundantly in the San Antonio area now, and introduction of native plants and animals. And we discuss all of these extensively in this book, that's forthcoming book. And then there are the compounding impacts of environmental pollution, diseases and zoonoses that we never had to deal with before, major potential problem with chronic wasting disease in the state that could severely impact the deer population, white nose syndrome, rabid hemorrhagic fever, and then there's the 900-pound gorilla of climate change, which I'll say a little more about. But here's the real issue. These are the Texas working lands, and the map shows the population density of people. And if you look at the working lands, you see they're declining. That is the wildlife habitat for the state. And we're beginning to see, particularly in these large metropolitan areas around the state, we're seeing situations where land conversion has become a major threat to wildlife habitat. And so we're seeing significant wildlife population trends, extirpation of species and subspecies, declines in geographic distribution. Some species are moving around, and we see a big increase in things that are considered endangered, threatened, or under some kind of vulnerability. And we've seen a lot of introduction of non-native species. When Bailey was in the state, there were really only two mammals that pretty much gone extinct, the bison and elk. But look at 2020, and you'll see what's happened over the course of the 20th century. And notice that most of those are carnivores, upper level. Is that a signal? 5 minutes, okay, we'll be done. And then we have completely lost some subspecies of mammals, and they're listed there. Here's some examples of mammals in decline: pronghorn, prairie dog, muskrat. And then Bailey, he studied the state extensively, and he only found armadillos south of the San Antonio River. And now armadillos have spread all over the state, and we've had the introduction of two serious pests of mammals, the nutria and particularly the feral hog. And a lot of introduced invasive species, including exotic ungulates, of which 11 have now become established as feral populations in Texas. And a growing list of threatened, endangered mammals. You'll hear from Mike Tuis and his colleagues about the ocelot, and you can see some of the other mammals listed that are under threat. We estimate about 35% of the mammals in the state have some questions about their long-term survivability. And mammals are moving around. I'll just show you two examples. We discuss all of the examples of major movements in the book, but here you see a bat that has spread extensively in the last few years. And here's another one that was not even in the state in the 1990s, but now has been established, a Mexican species, along the Rio Grande in the western part of the state. So the critters are moving, and they're moving with respect to changing climates. And there are some real challenges with bats in the state. I've written a lot about bats in the state, and those challenges relate to white nose syndrome and mortality associated with wind farms. There are hundreds of thousands of bats killed annually associated with wind farms. We look at 11 different strategies for conservation in the state. Obviously, I don't have time to discuss all 11, but I want to point out a few. The third one there, emphasis on conservation education. There are 500,000 new Texans moving into this state every year. Most of them are urban people, and they don't understand the system of Texas conservation. And so there's a real need for conservation education. And then if you look at number 4, incentivizing participation of private landowners, I mentioned that previously. There won't be effective conservation in this state without the continued participation of landowners. And then we propose kind of an interesting thing about the state. We call it a big, hairy, audacious goal, a BHAG. The current administration in Washington has proposed what they call a 30 by 30 plan, protect 30% of the state by the year, or the country by the year 2030. That's going to be a real challenge in this state because we only have about 2.5, 2.7% of the state set aside for conservation now. But notice that we have an extensive amount under wildlife management, about 17%. So we're really in the 20% neighborhood. So we're getting close, and that we have a possibility with the participation of landowners and more active management to reach that 30 by 30 goal. And I just wanted to show you what the state of Florida has done, another state with a lot of private land. They've approved a bond issue, $1 billion a year for 20 years to support conservation. And then last year, they approved a corridor program, $400 million a year over the same time period to create conservation corridors. And those can be created several ways, purchasing land or using easements and development rights to acquire that same capability from private landowners. And so we've talked about the opportunity in the book. We discussed an opportunity to establish the Texas Conservation Fund, which could be called something like Saving the Nature of Texas. And then I'll close with just a few quotes here from some people, what they have to say. I would draw your attention to Aldo Leopold, one of the great conservationists in the history of the country, and about the importance of the private landowner. There you see Stuart Udall, considered, I think, one of the best secretaries of Interior, and what he said about our heirs. The issue really is not many of us sitting in this room will see the demise of Texas wildlife, but our children and grandchildren could be faced with it. And that's really, I think, what a lot of the focus needs to be. And then you see my good friend Barry Lopez, the late Barry Lopez, what he had to say about an environment that only considers people and does not consider the importance of other kinds of life relative to people. And so I'll just close there and tell you that there is a postcard on the table if you're interested in the book. It's the culmination of my career and all of my studies on Texas mammals, and probably the last significant thing I'll do. And it's been done with a great deal of love and enjoyment. Thank you.
We can take questions. We have about 5 minutes. If you all have any questions for Dr. Schmidly before we go into our next 2 panels. So are there any questions from the audience? Go ahead.
Nobody's ever mentioned the wall.
The wall.
I write about the wall in the book. There's 2 things about the wall. One is it's a political thing, and the other, there's a biological implication, okay? I won't address the political stuff. That's not my world. But I will say if there is a continuous wall built along the Texas border, it will have serious conservation issues. For example, right now, if you look at northern Coahuila, Mexico, up through the Big Bend, all the way up to the Guadalupe Mountains, there is a corridor of wildlife habitat in which we've been able to restore black bear populations and bighorn sheep and elk. A wall through that area will cut off the flow, for sure, of black bear populations, and will probably result in the end of black bears in that part of Texas. That would be my prediction. So the choice of whether to do that wall or not is a political choice. But it will have biological implications, serious ones. Yes, sir.
Can you speak a moment about the potential for the Recovering American Wildlife Act?
I should have mentioned that. It's discussed in the book. The American Wildlife Act is an attempt to create a several billion-dollar fund that would be allocated to the states and to state agencies for conservation work. Texas would benefit with about $50 million annually. That bill has passed the House, and it's on the floor of the Senate. The way the bill works, it adds nothing to the tax burden. It is money that is collected through oil leases and other activities that will not require tax increases in order to allocate that money. And it seems to have bipartisan support. If that bill passes, it will be a huge advantage to the state of Texas to address wildlife, particularly non-game wildlife, and it would be a real benefit to all of the states. Yes, sir.
What Senate committee handles that?
It's the one chaired by Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico. It's called, it has some, a title has to do with land management of that sort, and they have moved it out of the committee, and they've moved it to the full floor of the Senate. And it should come up for vote shortly, I would think, and I think most people feel it has a very good chance of passing. It's not been caught in the political conflict yet.
You have a question over here, Dr. Schmidly?
Yes.
Has there been much research on the consequences of the drought of 10 to 12 years ago on Texas wildlife populations and maybe how that compared to the drought of record in the 50s? And then looking forward, if we have more of those droughts,
Yes.
5 to 10 years, what the impacts there?
Yeah, there has been. Mammal populations during a drought almost always decline substantially because they don't breed as often. So it has big consequences also for mortality. I think a big part of the problem with pronghorn, particularly in the Trans-Pecos, is a problem associated with drought. And so it's going to have big implications. We're in the middle of a serious drought in New Mexico. Where I live, we've had 3 inches of rain in the last 3 years. And the state is literally under fire. And all of that, of course, is destroying wildlife habitat immediately, but that fire long-term has some ecological benefits. So I think the biggest challenge with the drought is the lack of surface water. And wildlife depend on surface water. And I think that will be the biggest challenge in Texas, particularly in the western part of the state, will be the loss of the surface water. And you saw how abundant it was over a century ago.
We have another to the back of the room.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned fragmentation and invasive species as a challenge. Do you also consider invasive plants like invasive?
Oh, yeah. The salt cedar, the Chinese tallow on the Texas coast, salt cedar along the rivers and streams in the western part of the state. These have had big impacts on water resources and ultimately on wildlife as well. Invasive plants are a major problem, and so are invasive animals. And in terms of ecology of the state, nothing is worse than the feral hog. There are estimated now 3 million feral hogs in Texas, and they do enormous ecological damage all over the state. And they're almost impossible to control because they have, you know, when they breed, they produce so many piglets, they're very difficult to control.
We have time for one more question. Anybody else? One, go ahead.
Yes, sir.
We're here.
Are any of the invasive species actually beneficial? Are we glad to have them or no?
Yes, the ocelot is considered endangered by the Fish and Wildlife Service in the Endangered Species Act. It may be one of the most endangered mammals, if not the most in North America, at least in Texas.
I was asking about invasive species.
Oh,
Are any of the invasive species beneficial? Are they helping in any way or not?
well, you could argue that some of the invasive ungulates, of which there are many, that have been established in the hill country in South Texas have contributed to the incomes of ranchers for hunting purposes. And so you could argue that those have positive benefits. There's not a lot known about the long-term ecological implications in terms of their competition with native deer. And that could be a big issue. And also in terms of their potential to have viruses that could be transmitted to native mammals. We now, for example, know that COVID are in deer, and that's becoming a big concern. We don't know yet to the extent to which diseases that impact people like COVID might get established in these exotic mammals. That's not known yet.
Well, thank you all for your time, for showing up early. Thank you, Dr. Schmidly, for adjusting your schedule as well. Now we'll continue with two more panels and sessions over in the Memorial and Prassel auditoriums. So thank you again for being here this morning.